The Miami Grand Prix is over, and to no one's surprise, it was another 1-2 Red Bull finish. And whilst this might sound disappointing, there was a mixture of strategies going on. Even though yes, it was a one-stop, some drivers opted to start on mediums and some start on the hard tyres, and this actually led to an interesting race, which is why today we're going to be diving into and doing a data analysis on the Miami Grand Prix. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. Now let's get into the video. As usual, I'll be diving into the data for Mercedes, Ferrari, Aston Martin and Red Bull a little bit later on, so stick around for that. The Miami Grand Prix produced a very straightforward one-stop strategy, which unfortunately meant there was very limited strategy options, which we can see by the fact that there was a grand total of 20 pit stops, as not a single driver did 2 pit stops. However, it did lead to one important question, which ultimately decided the fate for many drivers in this race, and that was, what was the better tyre to start on? Was it the medium tyres or was it the hard tyres? Arguably, it turned out that the drivers who started the race on the hard tyres were in a much better position to attack the racetrack. But why is this? The main reason is because the hard tyres had very little degradation, meaning that as the laps wore on, they could just keep going faster and faster and faster. This very low degradation on the hard tyres meant that they could just stay out, whereas the medium tyred runners had a lot of degradation and graining. This meant that the drivers who started on this tyre had to go through that phase because they did not know how long the hard tyres would last. Many opted to stay out on the medium tyres for far too long, meaning that they missed out on the very stable hard tyres for about 5 or 10 laps. Even with a one-stop, there was a total of 60 on-track overtakes, making it the race with the most number of overtakes so far this year. The fastest lap of the race was a 1:29.708 by Max Verstappen in the Red Bull on lap 56 when he had very fresh medium compound tyres. Now, let's take a look into some data to see if we can understand anything from this Grand Prix. The first thing we're going to take a look at is what I would like to think are the biggest losers of the Grand Prix, and that has to be the McLaren team. For McLaren, Miami was a complete disaster, as they were, sadly for them, the slowest team overall in the Grand Prix, and we can show that by taking a look at all of the lap times between McLaren's Lando Norris, Alpine's Pierre Gasly, and the Haas of Kevin Magnussen. Just as a reminder, Norris was McLaren's faster driver, but as you can see, the majority of the lap times are slower than the Haas and the Alpine teams. And with that, let's now take a look into each of these drivers' fastest lap times to see what we can learn. With their fastest laps open, it becomes a little bit more clear what was happening in the race. McLaren, as they did in qualifying, were getting very good traction on the exit of corners, but as you can see on the graphs, they are missing out as usual on straight line performance, as they are constantly a few kilometers per hour slower than the other two teams. For McLaren this weekend, it feels like they could just not move forward. Norris was actually very consistent, as this graph shows. His bar is the smallest of any driver in the field, and this means that he was able to lap very much the same lap time all race long. Unfortunately for him though, these lap times that he was consistently doing were consistently slow. They need to understand where they can improve. Thankfully for McLaren, Imola is next, and that should be a circuit where we see them perform quite a lot better than they did in Miami. One midfield team that can be very happy with their performance in Miami, at least for one of their drivers, was the Haas team. In my qualifying data analysis, I said that Haas almost certainly would not be able to keep up with what was a brilliant qualifying session. However, points should be on the table for them if tyre wear was not too high, and that is precisely what happened for them, even if it is just 1 point. But Kevin Magnussen did have a great race, and was for a lot of the race managing to keep back the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc. This ability to hold back a Ferrari can give Haas some confidence in the ability of their car. But why was Haas so strong? Well, to take a look, let's compare the fastest lap of both Charles Leclerc and Kevin Magnussen, because this might be able to highlight why the Ferrari driver struggled so much to overtake the Haas. In this lap, neither driver has DRS, but what can we see? Well, what we can see is that Haas actually has a top speed advantage down the back of each straight, meaning that they can use this to defend from the Ferrari. Not only this, but they were pretty good on the brakes, and had decent cornering performance. We have seen this for much of the season that Haas is actually pretty strong in a straight line, but we actually got to see some good cornering performance and braking performance here in Miami. For Alpine, this was pretty much the best result that they could realistically achieve, as both Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon were the top two midfield drivers in this race. Esteban Ocon was one of the drivers who was able to benefit from starting on the hard compound tyres and then move forward when he went onto the medium tyres towards the end of the race when the circuit was in a much better condition. This improvement meant that we got to see much better lap times being posted in the back end of the race, and Ocon was able to overtake and move up the field in the closing stages with some great pace, as this graph shows when comparing the two Alpine drivers. But now, what about the top 4 teams, as we take a look at Ferrari, Aston Martin, Mercedes and Red Bull. And let's start with the Ferrari team. For Ferrari, Miami was a step backwards from what was a great Baku weekend. In Baku, they had great pace throughout the entire weekend. However, in Miami, they only seemed to have good pace over one lap. For Leclerc, the Grand Prix was a missed opportunity due to him throwing away his qualifying lap, which would have been good enough for P2. Instead, he had to start all the way down the order and really struggled to pass the Haas of Kevin Magnussen. For Carlos Sainz, things started off well, but he was stuck behind the Aston Martin of Fernando Alonso. On the medium tyres, it seemed like Sainz had more pace overall than Alonso, and we can see that in the telemetry. On the medium, Sainz was probably faster, but stuck behind the Aston Martin. But when they put the hard compound tyres on, Ferrari started to sink backwards, and the pace dropped. That is not the first time that we have seen that this year, but once again Ferrari struggled on the hardest compound of tyre and went from potentially being the second or maybe the third fastest to once again being the 4th fastest team on the hardest compound of tyres. This has been a common issue for Ferrari, however after Australia I thought it was an issue that they had solved. For Mercedes, Miami was a race weekend which seemed similar to 2022, where they would struggle over one lap in qualifying, but come race day their pace would be significantly better, and their management of tyres and tyre wear would be superior to their rivals. Whilst Ferrari was struggling with their degradation, Mercedes managed to keep their pace and tyres in a much better condition. Between the two drivers, Lewis Hamilton had a difficult weekend. It all started when he was knocked out in Q2 on pure pace, and the start of the Miami Grand Prix was not much better. Lewis started on the hard tyres, and that actually turned out to be a good thing, but at the beginning of the race he really struggled with pace as he got stuck in a DRS train. Being stuck in that DRS train really compromised his ability to move forward, and you can see that when comparing the lap times of Hamilton and his teammate George Russell. Russell was faster almost all of the way through the race. Even when Lewis switched onto the medium tyres, he had a significant tyre advantage over his rivals and still was not much faster than a few tenths when compared to George Russell. He was, however, able to overcome and overtake Charles Leclerc, which made his weekend somewhat better. For Russell, he had a great race, and when he bolted on a set of hard compound tyres, his race came alive, especially when compared to the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz. For Mercedes, they were clearly the 3rd fastest car in that race, and with updates coming in Imola, it will be interesting to see if they can maybe catch up and become the 2nd fastest car overall. For Aston Martin, it was a return to form for Fernando Alonso, as he was clearly the fastest car behind the all-dominant Red Bull duo. And finally for Aston Martin, they have improved straight line performance and were not the slowest car overall, which we can see from this graph here. In fact, as this other graph shows, the Aston Martin of Lance Stroll clocked in the highest top speed of the race, which was 351 km per hour. This is a positive step forward for the team, as they can start to build on what was already a downforce monster of a car, as they are looking to solidify themselves as the 2nd fastest team, and potentially even move closer to the Red Bull team. With Imola and Monaco coming up, Aston Martin are in a great position to maybe even snatch a pole position, and who knows, maybe even go one step better on the podium. Finally, for Red Bull, Miami was as clear and decisive of a victory as I think we have seen from them so far this year, and Max Verstappen was on another level after a mistake in qualifying. His race pace on used hards versus Perez on newer hard tyres was something to behold. Max did everything he needed to maintain the gap and did not make crucial errors, unlike Perez, which you can see when comparing both drivers on lap 33 and lap 38. This was a golden opportunity for Perez, and sadly he blew it by making mistakes which allowed Verstappen to be right behind him when Verstappen pitted for fresh medium tyres. Going into Imola, I am not sure how Perez will fight back and resist Max Verstappen, but it will be interesting to find out if he can, and also if any other team can start to close the gap as F1 heads back to Europe and we start to see more upgrades coming along. So with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, as always, comment, leave a like, and subscribe for more F1 content. Thank you all so much for watching.